order. Today's Monday, July 24th, 2023. Christina, will you please call the roll?
Dewey? James? I'm probably saying it completely wrong. James? I couldn't hear. James Dewey? How do you say it? Dewey? I apologize.
Yeah, how do you say your last name? Wing.
Silent H. Okay.
Thank you.
Known? Am I saying that one wrong also? Noni? Okay. Sorry about that. Mitchell?
Oh, here.
Rigby?
Here.
And Rachel Nawashok is excused today. Moreno?
Here.
Stewart?
Here. Thank you. Next on our agenda, we have a council update. Councilor Afghan, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Chair. As most of you know, we have many boards and commissions in City of Lake Oswego, a lot of citizen involvement. This last month or last month and a half, we appointed over 50 new members to all of our boards and commissions. This represents how much involvement we have, and a heartfelt thank you for all of those who volunteered and all of those who got appointment for the next few years to participate in the city business, including some of you. Thank you so much for volunteering. There were many items that were discussed this last city council meeting, full agenda and then some. A design build contract for the backup power at the Lake Oswego Tiger Water Partnership Facility project, neighborhood enhancement program grants, and part of that was for the August 1st neighborhood outdoor meetings. Franchise extension for Portland General Electric Company to operate an electric light and power system. So these are very common to do, but we get to review those and approve them. A resolution initiating proceeding to withdraw from a couple of locations vacating in Lake Oswego, and also a resolution initiating proceeding to withdraw 0.43 acres located at Upper Drive from Lake Grove Water District. A resolution affirming public necessity to acquire the real estates in Foothills area for wastewater treatment project. And we also approved an exception from competitive bidding for the Rosick skate park construction project. And we talked about the psilocybin, the time, place, and manner regulation that you had come up with, and that was also approved. It was a very detailed and also some philosophical conversation, and also about the requirements that you put forth. There were, I would like to be, most of you probably know this, but I also want to be open and honest and direct. 3 of the city councilors were against it. I don't know what happened between December and now, but they were against it. The other 4, 3, including myself, thought the restrictions were too much and it limits the possibility of somebody coming to Lake Oswego to provide this therapy. And one wanted to vote because the Lake Oswego residences had voted, the majority had voted to have this service in Lake Oswego. But from my perspective, this was a win for mental health and those who don't have any other options. If Lake Oswego is going to have a therapy services, even though the areas are very limited, this is an option for them if they can afford it. So many ifs in that conversation. We also had a library visioning report out and what the process was and what the recommendation was. Basically, the recommendation was that we need to have more space for our library, whether it's one big one or two similar, one bigger one and one smaller one, and so on and so forth. The entire city council agrees that we need to have a different library because our current library is 40 years old and it's not doing what the survey says we need to do. Having said that, all of us also agree that we are not at a point to make a decision whether it's $46 million or $90 million, and we want to pause the decision. This doesn't mean we don't continue with what is it we need to do, but it needs to bring in all the input and requests that we had for the visioning team. There were some conversations that we have too many projects at hand right now with wastewater treatment, the LO rack, the North Anchor, many parks projects. So we need to wait a little longer to see where these projects land before we decide which direction we're going and go back to the taxpayers and ask for more money. There's also conversations about, do we need more real estate? What does a library look like 20 years from now, 40 years from now? Then there is a conversation about, do we have one big one, one small one, or? So it was unanimous that we should continue with our visioning plans, but we're not ready to make a decision. So that's my report out. Any comments, questions, concerns, opens for me?
Any questions for Councilor Afghan? Oh, I think I don't see any. Thank you, as always, for your in-depth review.
Thank you so much, Chair. With that, I'm going to go in the background and I may even log out at some point. I appreciate you all participating and taking the conversations forward.
Thank you. Okay, moving on in the agenda to public comment for issues not on tonight's agenda. Do we have any public comments? Okay, thank you. Commission for Citizen Involvement, general updates. I think now is when I will talk about these couple postcards. So first one is so this is for National Night Out. The Old Town Neighborhood Association invites one and all to celebrate our police and fire departments. Meet with your wonderful neighbors and our brave first responders. Come enjoy pizza and games. If you wish, please bring a potluck item. And that's going to be Tuesday, August 1st from 5 to 8 p.m. at the George Rogers Park Picnic Shelter. Then the second one I have is for the same evening, the Lake Grove Neighborhood Association Neighborhood Night Out with the Lake Oswego Fire Department. from 7 to 9 p.m. at Iron Mountain Park, which is located at 2401 Iron Mountain Road. And the Lake Oswego Fire Department will be there and will give a fire truck tour and stickers for children. Refreshments will be provided. Does anyone have any other announcements? Seeing none, we'll move on to minutes. So we have 2 sets of minutes to review and approve. The first set is from June 26, 2023. Is there any discussion, or may I have a motion?
I'd like to move to approve those minutes.
Second.
Okay, I've got a motion and a second. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimous. And then on to the minutes from July 10th, 2023. Same thing, any discussion, or may I have a motion?
I move to approve the minutes from July 10th.
Is there a second?
I second.
All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Oppose?
I'd like to abstain.
Got 5 ayes and 1 abstain. That concludes the meeting minutes section, and we'll now move on to the work session. Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Work Session number 1. Public comment is accepted. And at this time, the Planning Commission will conduct a work session to discuss the city's efforts to comply with the state of Oregon's climate-friendly and equitable communities rules. Coordinator is Erik Olson.
Thank you, Chair Stewart. Yes, I'm here to discuss a little bit of an overview, I suppose, of the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules. So good evening, Chair Stewart, Vice Chair Moreno, and the rest of the planning commissioners. Here to sort of introduce this to folks, since there hasn't been much discussion in the last few months about this, and I think that this might be somewhat new to several of the folks on the commission. So I'll try to sort of provide a very sort of introductory level overview, and just would encourage you to feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions along the way. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, though. All right, so here's an overview of the topics that we'll cover during the presentation. Start out with some background of the CFEC rules, Climate Friendly and Equitable Community Rules, and their sort of intent. Then I'll review the schedule that we've proposed to meet the CFEC or CFEC requirements, and then I will explain the rules for CFEC that apply to Lake Oswego, including sort of the different options that we have to comply with parking phase B. So there are 22 slides in this deck, including this one. So just that's hopefully it won't take too incredibly long, but there's a lot of detail to go over here. So again, feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions.
Yeah, and just real quick, don't worry about like logging in. Just ask questions if you have them. You could just.
Thank you, Chair Stewart. All right, so I'll start with a bit of background on climate-friendly and equitable communities. So on March 10th, 2020, then Governor Kate Brown issued Executive Order 2004, directing state agencies to reduce climate pollution. Sort of a couple years later, on August 17th, 2022, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, or the LCDC, adopted permanent rules essentially to guide the implementation of that executive order. And they named it at that point the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Rules. Again, I'll be using that acronym CFEC. Apologies if I sort of don't spell it out at some point. It's a bit of a mouthful. So essentially, the CFEC rules require cities in the state's 8 metropolitan areas, including those in the Portland metro area, to update their comprehensive plan and development code to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. with a particular focus on reducing emissions from transportation. So specifically, the intent is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by 2035 and 50% by 2050. So this is sort of the idea is that this would be achieved through directing development into mixed-use centers and areas with transit to make walking, cycling, and transit safer and more convenient, to provide people with access to services and destinations, and to look for more equitable and inclusive outcomes that are intended to meet the needs of all Oregonians. So generally, the rules will require cities such as ours to change their local transportation and land use plans to do more to ensure Oregonians have safe, comfortable ways to get around and don't have to drive long distances just to meet their daily needs. Sort of other language from DLCD that that's relevant here is that the rules are intended to improve equity and help community transportation, housing, and planning serve all Oregonians, particularly those traditionally underserved and discriminated against. So that's a bit about the intent of that governor order as well as the rules themselves. I think that there are a lot of ways that they can be measured. There's a lot of sort of forecasting that the state has done. I'm not an expert on that particular, level of this project. However, we're looking at essentially the projections that we have currently. Again, this is kind of a lot of forecasting based on assumptions, based on the investments and plans that the cities throughout the state, rather, have already adopted. And then sort of they've done some scenario planning, if you will, to look at different outcomes based on some of these strategies that are included in the CFEC rules. So there's a lot of ways to sort of measure these things, but I'm happy to sort of provide more context for that if that's something that you want to dive deeper into. Yeah, I think to that point, I would just mention that, essentially, you can see here sort of on the graph that in 2007, the state had adopted sort of some fairly aggressive goals to reduce climate or GHG emissions, rather, from light-duty vehicles related to transportation primarily by 75% by 2050. So that was in 2007. At this point, they sort of had looked at some of those results, in 2022, 2020, I suppose it was, when they started looking at these, and realized that it wasn't quite headed in the right direction. And so that is something that's depicted on this graph right here. You can kind of see the gap between where, in terms of the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, that could be projected, based on current trends, investments, and plans that have been adopted throughout the state. We're looking statewide here in this graph. And so you can see that this is leading on a course where, the projection is that the reduction would be about 20% as opposed to that 75%. So it's really about, they're aiming to essentially have 4 times less pollution than what would be projected. So looking at 75%. From that 2007 figure is where they're aiming for. So really trying to close this gap more or less. So you can again see kind of where we're headed in that light green segment of the graph with the circles, and then where the state would like to take us with their adopted vision there in the darker green with the sort of squares indicating the progress. So there is definitely an intent to revisit this in the transportation systems planning realm, especially, and I will talk a little bit more about that, but, this is something that the state has been fairly actively monitoring. So, I guess it's important to point out, I guess, that, based on the current trends, folks, again, expect that Oregon could release more than 4 times more transportation pollution than their goal by 2050. So on that current path, we'd only reduce, again, transportation pollution by about 20% by 2050. And so, the state at least is worried that if we're polluting more than we had hoped for, that could result in more extreme weather events, more wildfires, ocean acidification, record heat waves, et cetera. So again, this is kind of their response. The CFEC rules are a response to this gap, and sort of the idea is to promote cleaner vehicles, cleaner fuels, and less driving through the CFEC rules. Any questions on the intent or sort of background there? I'm happy to sort of get more information on the specific methods that the state is using to monitor the program, if that's something that folks are interested in. All right, thanks for that. All right, so before I go into the rules themselves, I'll talk a little bit about the schedule that we proposed in order to meet the state requirements. So as you might have seen in the materials that we distributed in advance of this meeting, the city has received approval from the state, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, or DLCD, for an alternative deadline of December 31st, 2024 for Phase B of CFEC. And this is really, the intent is to better coordinate our changes with respect to parking and electric charging for electric vehicles with the development of the city's housing production strategies to identify potential overlap and ensure that they sort of work in tandem and are coordinated at least. So, you know, the extension does allow for additional time to sort of have a better sense of where we're heading with the housing production strategy when we're looking for you know, what the city will adopt to comply with CFEC. And we expect that this approach will achieve better outcomes for the climate while encouraging the production of needed housing. So the schedule includes 5 Planning Commission work sessions, 5 City Council study sessions, and a public workshop event, in addition to 2 updates that have already been provided to the Planning Commission thus far. We started discussing this back in June of last year, and we're waiting a bit on some progress in terms of the state election, to be candid, on whether or not to continue sort of pursuit of this, or sort of there was some speculation that this might be sort of headed in a different direction if the election might have turned out differently. So regardless, it was placed on hold a bit last year, and we have been providing some updates along the way, but we're really starting to sort of hit the ground running here this summer and working into next year. The Planning Commission hearing, we've tentatively scheduled for September of next year, and the hearing at City Council would be in November of next year. Again, we need to make sure to adopt something that complies by December 31st, 2024. Any questions on the schedule? All right, now we'll get to the meat, if you will. So I'll talk a little bit about the rules themselves. So they've been broken out into 5 general categories by the state. We have the initial phase of the parking-related mandates, or Phase A, which we've already, you know, the city has already implemented in time to meet that December 31st, 2022 deadline. The second sort of requirement here is related to electric vehicle charging, which the city has also complied with now. And we met the March 31st, 2023 deadline for that. I'll explain a little bit more in the coming slides. There are also requirements related to housing in climate-friendly areas, which the city already complies with due to our adoption of our 2 town centers, namely the Downtown Town Center and the Lake Grove Town Center. And that complies with Metro's 2040 growth concept and urban growth management functional plan. There are some communities that have not adopted town centers, and this is primarily the housing and climate-friendly areas would apply to those communities. There's also a requirement to update the city's transportation systems plan, which we expect to be required by November of 2024, November of next year. It is dependent on when the regional transportation plan is adopted by Metro, and we heard about that at our last work sessions, kind of what the schedule is there, and just a reminder that public comment is still open for that. So the last thing that we'll talk about is the bulkiest item, and that's Phase B of the parking requirements. And again, that's the element for which the city has received an extension until December 31st, 2024 for compliance. So that will be really the primary focus of a lot of the discussions that we'll have at the Planning Commission here in the next year and a half or so. So as I mentioned, the city met the December 31st, 2022 deadline for compliance with Phase A of the CFEC parking reform rules. So on January 1st, we applied these rules, and I'll just go over those rules really quickly before I talk about kind of how we did this. So these are currently, again, effective as of January 1st of this year. One parking space per unit is required now for multifamily residential development, regardless of the location in the city. So wherever that's allowed in the city is only allowed to require one space per unit. The city is not allowed to require, and we are no longer requiring parking for small residential units or units of less than 750 square feet, affordable units, and there's a special sort of way that those have been defined as essentially affordable to those earning 80% of area median income. So it's really just ensuring that your sort of individual who is earning 80% of average median income would not spend over 30% of their income on housing. That's how they sort of define affordable at the state. No parking can be required for childcare, no parking for facilities for people with disabilities, and no parking is required for shelters. In addition to that, no parking is required within 1/2 mile of frequent transit corridors, which is defined as 1 hour or greater service, which might not be considered frequent to many folks, but the only sort of area within the city that would be considered a frequent transit corridor for the purposes of CFEC is the TriMet bus line number 35. That's at least the most frequent bus line in the city, and again, it's considered a frequent transit corridor under CFEC rules. It's also requiring no parking within 3/4 of a mile of all rail stations, but there are no rail stations in Lake Oswego. So as you can see, this sort of no parking within 1/2 mile of bus line 35 is depicted on the map here on the screen. This is based on a straight distance and does not consider topography. And you can see that it really covers a large, you can see that it covers a large chunk of downtown. Really, we're talking about the majority of what we consider downtown in Lake Oswego when we talk about, a 1/2 mile from bus line 35 or State Street, Highway 43, we also refer to it. So, as allowed under the CFEC rules, what we did to implement this, we actually are applying the state rules directly. We did not go through a code amendment process because under CFEC, we are allowed to just do that to essentially reference the sort of state rules that apply here instead of modifying our development code itself. So we had received direction from City Council to do so, and that's what we have done. We've published technical resources to aid folks in sort of navigating this and learning about it and at least having a clear explanation on our site. So that includes information that's available on our public-facing interactive GIS map or LO map, as well as a cross-reference in the parking standard to the state rules themselves that apply here. So just wanted to point out that for ease of implementation, we might want to consider in the future actually amending our code to include these provisions. We will likely be amending the code for the Phase B portion of this. So that's just something to consider that might really make it a lot easier for folks to understand and would ease implementation in many ways. So that's just one thing that we can also consider at least as a part of the amendments that we'll be looking at for next year for Phase B.
Eric, did the city council say why they wanted it to be implemented directly as opposed to amending the code? I mean, is it just because it's easier to do it that way, or?
I think that's part of it. I think, another part of it is that they knew that there was going to be an opportunity to come through this Phase B work and sort of look at this a little bit more holistically. Again, there was, well, I guess first I would mention that Scott Siegel was the project manager for this, so he's the one that had been providing updates at that point. So I wasn't project manager at this time, but my understanding is that the project, was essentially because of that delay, we were waiting until the election last year to kind of get a sense of where to go with this and to, get that final direction from City Council as to how to administer this. And by that time, it was too late to go through and do a full code amendment by that sort of December 31st deadline. Any other questions on Phase A here? Again, this is something that we already have implemented in the code, so something that we're just starting to see, what that looks like. Just having discussions, really haven't seen any projects go through that are taking advantage of this yet. Okay, let me know. All right, so I'll move on to electric vehicle charging requirements, and Councilor Afghan might be able to provide some context on particularly that question as to what the decision was in terms of not adopting into the code directly. Let me know if he does want to provide input there. For now, though, I'll move on to the electric vehicle charging requirements. We did discuss this a bit at our last meeting with the presentation from Amanda Watson, the Sustainability Program Manager here at the city. So we've also met this March 31st, 2023 deadline for the EV charging component of the CFEC requirements. What this means is that now a minimum of 40% of all vehicle parking spaces are required to have conduit to serve electric vehicle charging for essentially new multifamily residential buildings and new mixed-use buildings consisting of privately owned commercial space and 5 or more residential dwelling units. So more or less, that's how we would define multifamily residential here at the city. So it is kind of consistent with what we just call multifamily residential. So in essence, what that means is that the requirements relate to the electric service capacity provided within the building, but don't actually require that actual EV charging stations be provided within the buildings. So that's just one clarification that I wanted to make here. The state defines electric service capacity essentially to refer to 2 things. One, a designated location or space for electrical service, if not the actual service itself, but just at least space for it, as well as a conduit system from that designated location to parking spaces. So the conduit system must be able to support wiring for the installation of level 2 or above electric vehicle charging stations under that mandate. I would also mention that under state building code, which was recently also amended as a part of this larger effort under CFEC, new commercial buildings are also subject to a 20% requirement under the state building code. So this is not something that we would implement within the development code necessarily, but there is a building code requirement for similar 20% of all vehicle parking spaces for commercial buildings to have conduit service. So similar to Phase A of the parking rules, we've been applying these provisions directly, and we have not made amendments to the code in order to apply this. So again, for ease of implementation, we may want to consider in the future amending the code to include these electric vehicle conduit provisions concurrently with those Phase B code amendments. Again, that's the due date of December 31st, 2024, if we wanted to just incorporate that into the code. And here I just have a graph showing that there's been a massive increase in electric vehicle registrations here in the city based on some data we got from the Lake Oswego Sustainability Network. So you can see that there's a need for electric vehicle charging and the capacity here in the city, particularly when it comes to multifamily residential or mixed-use buildings where it's not necessarily an individual tenant's decision whether or not they're able to have electric vehicle charging capacity. You could see that this could be really important to at least enable folks in those situations to have the ability to drive electric vehicles.
So quick comment. You had said that I think it's 2021. The building code now contains provisions for future charging EVs, conduit and everything. I wonder if, since the building code is now sort of carrying sort of the torch on that, if also trying to implement it into the development code may be redundant or difficult to manage. Just a thought.
Yeah, I think we can certainly consider whether or not we would like to include that commercial building requirement, that 20% requirement in the code itself or in the development code. Again, it is in the building code, but this sort of 40% requirement would be just a development code sort of planning related provision. So that is certainly something that would also ease implementation and just make things a little bit clearer for your average applicant.
In my experience, when things start to overlap, they can get
Yeah. Well, unfortunately here, we do have some overlap as required by the state because there is at least a 20% requirement related to multifamily and mixed use currently in the building code. This will sort of go further than that, or is already going further than that based on the state sort of statute. All right, so now I'll talk a little bit about the Transportation Systems Plan update. So the CFEC rules require Metro to undertake what they call scenario planning as they update the Regional Transportation Plan, or RTP, for the purpose of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles. So following Metro's adoption of updates to the RTP, the cities in the Portland metro area are then required to update their TSPs, or Transportation Systems Plans, to be consistent with that Regional Transportation Plan. They're sort of, the Regional Transportation Plan is kind of an umbrella under which the local city transportation plans are housed, if you will. On July 10th, as we covered in our last meeting, Metro released a draft 2023 Regional Transportation Plan and made it available for public comment through August 25th. And we received a presentation from Metro and city engineering staff about that. So I would just mention that Metro needs to complete their regional transportation update by December 6th, 2023, though its current work plan, that looks like, is aiming to complete that work sometime in November. Essentially, what the city needs to do is adopt an TSP, a local sort of city TSP, within 1 year of Metro's adoption of the RTP. So that looks like it would result in a deadline of approximately November of next year, November 2024, for the city to update our TSP. A lot of things that are in our current transportation systems plan are already in compliance with the CFEC rules, although there are a few things that would be relatively new additions that are requirements under CFEC. So that includes identifying areas with concentrations of underserved populations, using the best available data, and a major equity analysis. So really looking at, again, incorporating the equity component into this TSP update. So staff is going to continue to keep the Planning Commission updated on these efforts and collaborate with the Transportation Advisory Board on a TSP update that is required next year. Any questions on the Transportation Systems Plan update? All right, I keep saying that we're finally getting to the meat, but this is really the meat. This is the options for Phase B. This is the most complicated part of what we're going to be discussing here. So please bear with me, and again, do not hesitate to ask questions. All right, so as we mentioned in an earlier slide, the city received approval from DLCD, State Department of Land Conservation and Development, for an alternative deadline of December 31st, 24 for all of the Phase B parking requirements. While there are some options for compliance with Phase B, and I'll talk about those in just a moment, there are other baseline provisions that the city must comply with and for which there are no alternatives. So these baseline parking regulation improvement rules require the city to implement all 8 of the provisions that you can see on the screen here. And I will go through those one by one here. Just, again, feel free to interrupt. So the city, under any option, just as a baseline requirement, is required to require the preferential placement of carpool and van pool parking. The city will have to allow for the redevelopment of any portion of a parking lot for bike or transit uses. The city will have to allow and encourage the redevelopment of underutilized parking for other uses. We'll have to allow and facilitate shared parking. We'll also have to require that surface parking lots over a half acre in size either have 40% tree canopy, include green energy technology, or include solar panels. The city will need to require street trees be provided along driveways, or that a minimum of 30% tree canopy coverage is provided over parking. The city will need to require the provision of pedestrian facilities between buildings and pedestrian-oriented rights-of-way, and also establish off-street parking maximums in appropriate locations like downtowns, designated regional community centers, or transit-oriented developments. So we have to do all 8 of those things as a baseline. Any questions about that? Unfortunately, this isn't one where there's many options to discuss. But yeah, that's sort of, again, one of the first set of at least these baseline requirements.
I was just curious, kind of dumb question, but what happens if you don't? Let's say maybe you skip a couple, just, what's the ramifications of that?
Well, we would not be in compliance with CFEC. You know, we have received direction to comply with that and to a degree. You know, I'm not sure exactly what the ramifications would be. I think that, yeah, that might be a question for Deputy City Attorney Boone.
Typically, non-compliance with LCDC requirements result in enforcement orders, which could result in directly applying the standards, the LCDC standards directly.
Okay. And there's no wiggle room for creative interpretation?
Well, I don't know that yet. I don't know what, you know, and what if we allow but don't encourage? You know, and what is encourage? I don't know what that, you know.
Yeah, well, that was some of my, you know, the wording is like open for wiggle room, and so I was just curious how much wiggle room we have. Or don't. I don't know. I always like to bend the rules as much as I can, so it's kind of fun to see just how much pain can you cause back to the government. Okay, I was just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's probably correct to assume that there could be an enforcement order. I'm not sure exactly what form that would take, given that there are multiple options that we could take to comply. One might assume that they would take the most extreme path, but you never know. And I probably should not even try to speculate on that. And yeah, I think I should mention that there are a few of these that we already do, particularly when it comes to shared parking, and a few other items on this list. You know, we've already kind of reached compliance here at the city. So I can quickly sort of review when it comes to these particular provisions. So I think, yeah, we can talk a little bit more about specifically where we do comply, but I think that there is more language about the shared parking, you know, for instance, requirements, and it might be the case that while we do allow shared parking, there are additional actions that we need to take to, quote unquote, facilitate it or comply with rules related to shared parking, even if we have some of those in our code already. All right, and so in addition to these baseline requirements, the city would have to select one of 3 different options that you can see on the screen here in order to comply with Phase B of the parking regulation provisions. So I will explain these in more detail, but I think this is really helpful just to kind of see what the sort of larger landscape is of what is required for compliance with these rules. The first option is quite simple. It's just to repeal all parking mandates. Other options are significantly more complicated, involve either sort of a reduction of parking mandates or a parking management approach. And there are, you know, different options where, you know, the city, you know, can kind of pick and choose what it wants to do, but there are some, again, requirements that, you know, both option 2 and 3, regardless if you select 2 or 3, you still have to do a number of different things. So I'll get into that in just a moment. Again, all of this is required to be completed by December 31st of next year. So the first option, as I mentioned, is to just repeal all parking mandates. So it's pretty self-explanatory, if you will. The sort of simplest route, I would say, would be just to take this very simple approach. However, there are a lot of potential ramifications of doing so. If the city were to choose this approach, if they were to repeal parking mandates, there would be no additional action needed for compliance. So it is, again, fairly simple. The option is really based on the idea that parking can take up a significant amount of space. So you can see the diagram on the slide depicts kind of the spatial ramifications of a parking requirement. And this is one that we used to have in the city, requirement for 1.5 spaces of parking for a 2-bedroom apartment. We had that prior to Phase A of the CFEC rules, which can only, for which we can only require 1 space per unit. But the city's former parking requirement, you can see essentially, you can see that 1.5 spaces of parking would be over half of the space, the actual sort of floor area required for a 2-bedroom apartment itself. So that's 488 square feet as opposed to 900 square feet. So you can see it just, including drive aisles and things of that nature, that parking does take up a lot of space. And I think that's kind of one of the basic tenets of why the state has been sort of promoting this. You can see that, that space, if you look at sort of the diagram on the bottom right, there is a lot of land that's dedicated to parking in a lot of sort of town center areas or in a lot of cities in general. So I think there's another concept that this makes housing more expensive to develop, and that the requirement for parking reduces in the provision of parking that might not be needed under market sort of demand conditions. So that, I think, is the concept, that the market would provide parking if there was demand for it. And yeah, that you can't really anticipate the demand of the tenants as a city, as well as potentially the developer themselves that's looking for a certain type of market might be able to anticipate that. So I think that's something that, again, we don't have to talk about in much detail, but you can see that there is a lot of space dedicated to parking in the city. And I think when we start talking a little bit more about our housing production strategies, we'll find that there is a need for additional land to provide housing. So this would be at least one way to accomplish such a thing. All right, so now we'll get into options 2 and 3, which are most likely going to be the most palatable options, one of those two for folks for compliance. So under both options 2 and 3, you're required to comply with all 8 provisions that you see on the screen here. I've added little check marks to sort of indicate where the city is already in compliance. That sort of muted check mark indicates where we're in partial compliance. So I'll just state that garages and carports may not be required for residential developments, and we don't currently do that as a city. Garage parking spaces must be able to count at least towards off-street parking mandates. That's something that we already allow here in the city. Shared parking is required to be allowed to meet parking mandates. That's something, again, that we already have in our code. And this sort of requirement that required parking spaces may be provided off-site within 2,000 feet of pedestrian travel. The city complies in part with that. We actually allowed shared parking within 500 to 1,000 feet of pedestrian travel, so we'd have to expand it to 2,000 feet. The provisions where we're not currently in compliance are sort of 5 through 8 here. So the parking mandates shall be reduced by 1 off-street parking space for each 3 kilowatts of capacity in solar panels or wind power provided. So that's something that we would have to do for for both option 2 and 3. Parking mandates shall be reduced by 1 off-street parking space for each dedicated car-sharing parking space in a development, which is, it seems fairly straightforward, I suppose. Parking mandates shall be reduced by 2 off-street parking spaces for every electric vehicle charging station provided in a development. So you can see that there is an incentive provided here for developers to actually provide those electric vehicle charging stations themselves, not just the conduit. And the 8th requirement here is that parking mandates shall be reduced by 1 space for every 2 units in a development that are fully accessible to people with mobility disabilities. So again, an incentive to produce more accessible types of housing development. Any questions here? I'll keep moving. So another sort of component of the baseline requirements under both options 2 and 3 it relates to sort of selecting one of these 2 options. So all 8 of the requirements on the last page must be adopted, and the city will have to select one of these 2 options. The first option is to remove all parking mandates within climate-friendly areas and within 1/4 mile distance of those areas. And again, I just point out that the town centers here in Lake Oswego include the Lake Grove Town Center and the Downtown Town Center, which you can see indicated on the screen here. And there's a lot of more information that we can provide on that and that we can get into in the future. But these are town centers that we've established in compliance with the sort of metro code, if you will. So that's one of the options. The second option would be managing parking. So it would be more of a parking management approach, as they call it. This would include adopting a parking benefit district with paid on-street parking and some revenues dedicated to public improvements in the area. It would also include adopting amendments to require no more than 1/2 off-street parking space per dwelling unit in the area, and that's within the sort of designated parking benefit district, as well as adopting land use regulations without parking mandates for commercial developments. So essentially, regardless of the other sort of requirements within this parking benefit district, there would be no parking requirements for commercial development. So again, really, there's a decision that can be made. There's a different approach that can be taken for the removal of all parking mandates within specifically what the state deems as these climate-friendly areas, or again, that parking management approach, which would sort of get the city into a business that we're not really in right now. It would be a relatively new policy approach and require ongoing administration for these new sort of parking district management policies. And again, this isn't something that we really do right now in Lake Oswego. So we don't currently collect revenue from on-street parking fees or administer or manage any program of this nature in the city, and there would likely be a negative budgetary impact to the city under that sort of parking management approach. So that's just one thing to take under consideration. All right, so I've been talking about some of the requirements for both options 2 and 3. Now let's just talk about option 2. Essentially for option 2, the city would need to comply with 3 of the 5 provisions, or to implement rather 3 of the 5 provisions that you can see here on the screen for what the state is referring to as the fair parking approach, or option 2. So first of all, the first 2 options are related to the unbundling of parking spaces. So there would be a requirement that parking spaces be unbundled for residential developments of 5+ units, or and unbundled for commercial development, again 3 of 5, so it could be either or, I suppose. I'll just explain what unbundled parking means really quickly. That essentially means parking that is separately leased or sold from the development for which it was initially provided. So it essentially means that parking spaces for each unit in a development must be rented, leased, or sold separately from the unit itself at market rates for comparable off-street local parking. The renter, lessor, or buyer of the unit must be allowed to opt out of renting, leasing, or buying the parking space. So if it was a required parking space for residential development, they would still have the ability to take advantage of that, but they would have they would need to be allowed to opt out. And I'll just mention that that is something that we, again, don't currently necessarily do as a city. There might be some legal concerns related to enforcing this requirement on folks, although there are developments within the city where parking has been, quote unquote, unbundled. Particularly, I think a good example is the Windward, where it's not necessarily the case that all of the units are sort of bought, leased, and sold to tenants of that development. Third option is one that the city is partially in compliance with again, and I think it's more just we need to look into more of the specific details of whether our current approach meets this requirement, but we do currently have a flexible commute benefit, and again, the requirement, I guess I'll just explain that first. One of the 3 options, or one of the 5 options here, one of the 3 things that we could select is that we would require employers of 50+ employees to provide a flexible commute benefit if they provide free or subsidized parking to their employees at the workplace. So there's generally already a requirement that employers with 50+ employees in the Portland metro area provide incentives for commuting through this sort of flexible commute benefit. under the Department of Environmental Quality. The state sort of DEQ regulations already kind of include some of this. So we do employ more than 50 people here at the city, and we do meet those DEQ requirements to provide free TriMet bus passes and designate preferential carpool parking spaces, but it's unclear whether compliance with those DEQ rules also satisfies the CFEC rules. Pause. Moving on to the fourth one here. So the other option here, the fourth option, would be to enact a tax on the revenue from commercial parking lots, with revenues dedicated toward improving transportation alternatives to drive-alone travel. The city, as I've mentioned, currently has no known commercial parking lots. A tax on commercial parking lot revenue would be difficult to administer, and there could be some associated cost concerns with enforcing and administering this in the long term. Somewhat new and untested, at least within the context of the city. So just something to consider for number 4 there. Number 5 is to reduce parking mandates for new multifamily residential development to no more than 1/2 space per unit, including visitor parking. So that would be a little bit more simple for the city to comply with by simply amending the development code to reduce that requirement, as opposed to sort of establishing a new program to collect revenue from commercial parking lots and enact a tax, et cetera. So that was option 2. Now I will describe option 3. There's just this in one more slide, or I guess there's 2 more slides to explain this. So this is, again, the most complicated part of the most complicated phase of this project. So option 3 here would require the city to comply with all of the above provisions or to implement them. And so there's no really options available to the city under this option. So option 3 is what they refer to as the reduced regulation parking management approach. And under this approach, the city would not be allowed to require parking for climate-friendly areas and areas within 1/2 mile pedestrian travel of climate-friendly areas. So you can see that there's a bit of overlap with some of those earlier requirements where we saw one of the options was to reduce parking requirements within climate-friendly areas and areas within 1/4 mile pedestrian travel of climate-friendly areas. So there could be some potential to sort of hit 2 birds with 1 stone in some of these provisions. The city would not be able to require parking for mixed-use development, group quarters, such as dormitories, religious group quarters, adult care facilities, retirement homes, and other congregate housing. We would not be able to require parking for studio apartments, 1-bedroom apartments, and condominiums. There would be no parking required for changes of use or redevelopment of vacant buildings. And yeah, this is another provision where the city partially complies currently, but we would not be allowed to require parking for changes of use or redevelopment that may otherwise require additional parking. Again, we do partially comply with that, but we would have to amend the code a bit further. There would be no parking required for the expansion of existing businesses as long as that was an expansion of less than 30% of the building footprint. No parking for buildings with a historic designation, small commercial properties of less than 10 employees or less than 3,000 square feet. No parking for developments built under the Oregon Residential Reach Code or buildings seeking LEED certification. No parking required for schools, and no parking for bars and taverns. So those are 13 pretty inflexible provisions that the city would need to implement in order to comply with option 3 here. In addition to those 13, well, actually, I just want to talk a little bit more.
Sorry, could I jump
Yeah.
in? You said no parking for schools?
That's right.
I'm assuming you're referring to public schools, right?
I think it would apply to private schools as well.
Public and private.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so this is a rendering of the windward development here in Lake Oswego's downtown area, or the downtown town center, if you will. And just kind of pointing out that under option 3, there would have been no parking required for the windward. It's a mixed-use development, multifamily residential. It's likely that, yeah, under the CFEC provisions, there would not have been any required parking. It is worth pointing out, though, it's unclear how that policy change would impact the development of parking or neighborhood livability in future developments, because we have seen several instances where developers provide more parking than required, or do provide parking where it's not required. So there is also, again, that sort of ability for the market to dictate what parking is provided, and just because it's not required doesn't mean that it could not be provided. So I just wanted to make that simple point. All right, so the last component of option 3 for phase B, again, this reduced regulation approach is to implement one of 2 pricing mechanisms. So the first option would be to designate at least one residential parking district or parking benefit district. Again, there's some overlap with some of the other options here. And this would be an area where on-street parking is managed through paid permits, meters, or other types of payments. Again, this is a situation where creating a new program like this would have a significant budgetary impact, and it's difficult to kind of estimate the costs of what this would mean to the city, especially one of the size of Lake Oswego, although there are some other examples of cities of our size undertaking a similar type of approach. Another option that we would have is to require essentially that parking for multifamily residential units be unbundled parking. You'd recall that sort of option 2 had a couple of options related to unbundling, so this would be another sort of way to incorporate it into this option 3. And yeah, you know, there could be, again, concerns, as I mentioned earlier, about, you know, whether we can actually require developers to quote unquote unbundle their parking. And that's something that we can sort of dive into a bit further as we continue here. But that wraps it up. There is a lot more to sort of dig into here, of course, but today my goal was really just to provide an outline and overview of what options the city has to comply with the CFEC rules. So I would like to open it up to questions.
Have you done any initial research into that question, that last question? Whether you can require parking to be unbundled?
We have not done the research into that. There are some questions, but I think there's precedent for it as well. So that is something that we can dig into.
Yeah, I mean, in the example, the property owner wanted to unbundle. Okay.
Right.
Now, the question here is, can we require them to unbundle? Well, it's kind of their property. You know.
Right, that's why
I start with that.
I was wondering what,
Right.
you know, your thoughts were on
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
it's, well, I will ask the commission.
Well, one thing
Not this
one thing
commission,
that
commission.
one thing that concerns me a little bit is, you know, we talk about accessible dwelling units, and I think we need to bundle an accessible parking space with an accessible unit. Just, you know, the thing that I guess what worries me a little bit about what happens when parking is reduced is the amount of accessible parking is a function of how many total parking spaces there are. So like if you have 100 parking spaces, you have to have, you know, 6 or 7 accessible parking spaces. So when you start to reduce it, then that requirement goes down also, but maybe you have 5 accessible units, so maybe you need 5 accessible parking spaces. You see what I'm saying? That's kind of my concern with
Yeah, you know, I
what
think
I've heard so far.
just as a response to that, you know, there might be a way to, if not get creative in terms of our interpretation of these rules, but to adopt additional regulations to potentially mitigate some of their impact that might still be in compliance. So we can certainly, you know, look into whether or not, you know, we could do something of that nature in terms of trying to ensure that if accessible housing is being constructed, that accessible units are provided along with that.
That are in fact accessible.
Right, yeah. Yes, and accessible to those units specifically in terms of the space. So, yeah, I think I know what you're getting at here, and I think, you know, there's no clear language on whether we can and can't do that, but we can explore it.
I'm kind of just looking for the theme that's involved here. Are we talking about reducing parking because it's climate friendly, that it will aid that cause?
That's the idea. The idea is that, yeah, providing parking can sort of increase the demand to drive in some ways, that there's potentially a latent demand that, you know, increasing the amount of parking spaces could actually encourage folks to drive more than they might otherwise.
Well, I'm curious here because if you take a look at the development, and it's recent, it's within the last at least 6 years, and that is the Lake Oswego Village area down there. That's got minimal parking because there are cars driving around there all the time trying to find a place to park. And it would just seem like to me, talk about climate friendly, that's not climate friendly when you've just got cars driving around looking for a place to park. And the reason why I'm familiar with that is because right across the street is the church that I work with. And we were required to have X amount of parking spaces. And actually, those spaces are used a lot by people who are building in the area. So that if you have some building going on in that area, they can't park in the Lake Oswego Village area, but they can come over and use the parking area of our church. So you've got all these different factors going on. And I'm just wondering, as we go down this, which one of these things is going to actually help that situation out, which seems to me to be the situation that exacerbates climate friendliness, because there's just so much of traffic going on there, and the use of random parking lot. How do you manage that? I mean, that's all, this is all random. You can't really kind of plan for something like that. What's your thought about that?
Yeah, the thought, I guess, is that, I certainly understand where you're coming from, and, I think that's a great observation in terms of the, folks circling to find parking. We can, I guess one of the things I'm looking for from the commission is if there are any areas of interest or areas of concern where we might want to really start to dive in a little bit more deeply in future work sessions to talk about, potentially certain approaches, why they might be more, quote unquote, climate friendly than others, perhaps. But, there is a rationale to why folks, even with the idea that they could be circulating looking for parking spaces, would still think that providing less parking could be encouraging more sort of climate-friendly types of transportation activity. Whether or not we think that's likely to happen is one thing, but we do have these state requirements that we do have to sort of comply with. So regardless of whether we agree with the rationale, we have a pretty strict sort of set of approaches that we can choose from. Yeah, I'm not sure that any of those would really take a look at, providing staging area for construction or whatever it might be for vehicles that are doing work in that area. It's unfortunately not within the purview of these rules right now. But I think that there is at least an assumption that that the sort of reduction or sort of elimination of parking mandates will produce sort of positive impacts on the climate. And I think there's copious amounts of research that we can talk about that shows those effects. So that is something that we can
to my end,
does this come from the state of Oregon that the city is supposed to comply with?
Yes, it's development.
You get a set of rules that the state wants to employ, and then you have to match it with whatever you're doing here as a city to satisfy the state's concerns?
Correct. I mean, DLCD, Department of Land Conservation Development, has adopted a rule that is implemented and requires cities to do these things, okay? And it doesn't talk about substantial conformance. If you can come up with some other plan that achieves climate friendliness effects, there's nothing like that. It says, you shall do 5 of these 8, or whatever. So whether that's a good idea or a bad idea from whether in fact it deals with climate friendliness is, from the lawyer's perspective, is kind of irrelevant as long as the rule is valid. And that's somewhat of a question because there is a case pending that's being challenging that. But if the rules are valid, and they are valid until they're repealed or removed by by a DLCD or by a court order, then we shall follow them. And that's where we go.
I'd say you got a real challenge ahead here with Lake Grove, because all along Boones Ferry Road there has been a lot of really interesting development going on there. And if you, for instance, restricted parking along there, that would be a tremendous burden on the developers. And none of this really, it just seems like to me is that in the areas, I live over in that area, and the areas that have been developed there really pose a problem as far as accidents that are occurring in these parking lots, where there's been a narrowing of spaces and so forth like that to accommodate the increase in customers and so forth that never were historically there at all. So this also confuses me in a way, because it sounds really logical, but when it comes to the development of certain areas here of Lake Oswego, you've got some real competing values that go against making something climate friendly, because you've got businesses there that, you know, are actually asking for more customers and more parking spaces at the same time.
You know, one thing I would point out is that, you know, the commission's work is going to be really trying to figure out which of these options is going to fit best in Lake Oswego. That's what your work is really going to center around. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of creativity to come up with other options. So, you know, and staff will help you, you know, lay out the background and which options that, you know, might be recommended, and we can decide what's best for Lake Oswego. The other thing to remember is that ultimately, a builder could still provide parking. We just can't require it. So it may not make sense in places like Lake Grove for a while for you know, to redevelop parking lots or not provide parking for those businesses. So we may still see parking, but some areas like downtown, that makes a lot of sense for those builders or developers to not provide parking if they're not required to. So I think you're going to see different areas develop differently, and it'll be driven a lot by the market, but it's just that we can no longer require it the way we used to.
Well, thank you.
Erik, go ahead.
I would just, to follow up on that really quick, I would say that, you know, the approach that we could take where it would actually limit parking would be to establish parking maximums, and those are options. There are certain options that we could take to do so. But again, yeah, there's nothing about these rules that would sort of require developers to not provide parking. You know, there's nothing that would restrict them from providing parking. It's more just opening it up to a more market-based approach, if you will.
Can we go, I have a question about the drastic option one that nobody wants to talk about. Are there comparable cities where there's no parking mandates? Like, is there an example of if that drastic option were to be implemented, this is what it looks like?
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure of comparable cities.
No, I think we said New York at the same time.
Portland is another place. But yeah, you know, in terms of comparable, in terms of size, I would be surprised if there wasn't a city that took this approach, but I don't think it's common. And again, we can provide more context in the future on that.
Yeah, I mean, I've realized how crazy option one sounds, but philosophically, if we're going to say let the developers and let the market decide how much to put, then option one doesn't sound that crazy, right? And then the second part of that question is, what were the reasons for parking mandates to begin with? Why did we implement parking mandates? Do we know? Like, I don't know, are they 50 years old? Like what, you know, understanding the reasons behind why we implemented them might be good to decide whether we actually need them or we can just eliminate them altogether.
I think that's a very good point. And, you know, I think there's a demand for parking, and I think a lot of things that are in demand, folks think that the only way to get them is to require it. There are examples where if you don't require parking, it hasn't been provided, and there have been issues. So it's not like that's impossible by any means. But I think, you know, it's just worth sort of to piggyback on what you're saying, that the provision or the sort of requiring parking can really add to the cost of a development in cases where they might, you know, want to provide slightly less parking than they would under that requirement. So that's something that we can provide a little bit more context on. There's a lot of research showing that there's a direct impact on that cost of development related to the provision of parking, and I think that's a huge driver coming here. It's also about housing and making housing easier to build. You know, making housing easier to build, producing housing, but also in certain areas where you might want to promote the housing being constructed, those town center areas in particular. So that's another big factor to consider.
To play it out, the developer, it costs 12 million when there was a parking mandate. Let's say we remove it, and now only costs 10 million, right? The risk of removing a parking mandate is that the developer builds this for $10 million, and then people are like, I don't want to live there because there's no parking, right? Like, isn't all of this risk on removing a mandate? Put aside the accessibility issue for a minute, because I do think that's important. But isn't all the risk going to be on the developers to build something that people are going to come to?
I think that's a very accurate statement. Yeah, I think that we know what the market's like out here in Lake Oswego. We talk to a lot of folks when it comes to, for instance, even middle housing, where we have a certain, you know, for cottage clusters or something like that, we would require 1 space per unit. A lot of folks want to provide more than that, and they know that in order to sell, they would need to. So that's, you know, just something to consider. Again, it's not a guarantee, but
Sure.
it does, you know, the market does have a way of providing for that, at least.
Well, I'd say, I mean, I think we've all seen instances of where, you know, one could say maybe inadequate parking resources lead to people taking advantage of nearby parking, say in someone's neighborhood, you know, clogging up residential neighborhoods, that sort of thing. Something pretty common in certain areas of Portland, can be pretty frustrating. So, you know, that would be one reason why, you know, parking minimums might have been implemented in the first place. You know, I wasn't there. I wonder, there were a couple paths forward that were discussed in the memo and in the presentation that were labeled as potentially being pretty burdensome in terms of city resources, like creating like a parking district, essentially charging for street parking and taxing parking, something like that. I wonder if it would be possible to, as we go forward, to maybe investigate more minimal versions of those and see if those would be less burdensome. Something that is maybe more laxly enforced, or you know, whether those could be implemented with without the same institutional burden.
Noted. I think that's absolutely worth looking into. Thank you. I think just kind of, again, some thoughts that arose when you were talking about that. I think enforcement of something like unbundled parking is, again, something that the city is, and not just specific to unbundled parking, but a lot of parking related requirements is something that the city is not, we don't currently do this, and it might be sort of, there might be a lot of new territory to test, I guess, when it comes to those waters. But that, yeah, I think that doesn't mean that it's not worth looking into, of course, but I think just one thing to keep in mind is that it might be really difficult to do things like monitor, for instance, thinking about like the requirements for, or the sort of lack of parking requirements rather, for buildings constructed that are seeking LEED certification or in compliance with the Oregon Residential Reach Code. These are, or at least LEED in particular, is something, and I think REACH is as well, something that needs to be maintained over time. So even though a city or a development might get sort of a LEED certification or be seeking LEED certification, we would have to make sure to consider, you know, are they maintaining that certification? Are they maintaining the sort of aspect of the development that makes it sort of worthy of not having a parking requirement, if you will? So a lot of these approaches, I guess, is really what I'm trying to say, involve fairly nuanced levels of monitoring when it comes to compliance with this stuff for private sort of property owners, commercial property owners, multifamily developers, et cetera. So yeah, I think, just kind of to put it all in context, there are, potential sort of pitfalls, if you will, for different approaches here. So we'll try to give you a little bit more of a sense of the pros and cons with the parking management.
I'll just add historically, I was just looking at the code here, 1961 is apparently when we first started requiring parking.
Here's your answer.
Yeah, I'd be curious to read the legislative history. I imagine it goes probably directly against the legislative history of
Our first
passing
zoning
this.
ordinance was like in 1947, so that was pretty minimal. So I think 61 is when we first got DR3 and 3.75, and I mean, kind of like first real zoning code.
There was a fairly car-centric planning approach at that period of time.
Yes. That was my not so subtle smile.
Well, good discussion, everyone. So what is our next steps now?
So the next step, at least according to our schedule here, will be another work session and study session. So work session, we're doing them sort of in tandem, if you will. So I'll present to City Council, present to Planning Commission. So we'll have another work session coming up. Let me just make sure I get the date right here. The next one will be on September 5th. September 5th will be the City Council study session, and September 25th will be the work session here at the Planning Commission. So really, I want to delve into a little bit more of these options and weighing those pros and cons and get more direction at that meeting, and that's kind of what I would like to do. There are a lot of things that we could really dive into, so if there's anything that you've already sort of given me some good direction on this and things to sort of hone in on a little bit more to discuss and refine our thoughts about. But yeah, September 25th, we'll have more discussion and hopefully start weighing these options a bit further.
And I apologize, I didn't mean to cut off the discussion, so if there's any last minute, any other points to make, please go ahead.
Commissioner Twing?
I have a question. So what's the difference between the City Council study session and the Planning Commission work session?
One is with the City Council, one is with the Planning Commission.
I know, well, okay, what's the difference between a study session and a work session?
That's what City Council
Discussion.
calls their work sessions.
But
and
it's
that's
just the same discussion about it.
right.
Okay.
Well, yeah, and there's also, lots of opportunities for this project and some others to potentially do a joint meeting with the City Council, and I think that will be something that we could try to coordinate at a sort of critical point in the process, if you'd like. But the idea is to, present similar material and get direction from the Planning Commission at one and get direction from the City Council at the other.
I had one question for you.
If you consider the notion of removing these parking mandates, is that for the future of any building that takes place? You're not looking backwards, in other words?
Yes, that's correct. So if we changed our parking standards and someone had more than the maximum allowed parking, so we established some maximums, they would have a non-conforming right to maintain that. But if they ever redeveloped or, part of the parking lot, they couldn't put it back later on. You lose it once it's gone. You lose your non-conforming right. So, but yeah, we won't require any of the existing businesses to now comply.
But I think maybe the question is as to a modification. If they were required and then they seek a mod to do something else with that property, with that area, then it would be permitted.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there could be, just to, I guess, expand on what Evan was saying, there could be developments that were approved through a development review permit at the Development Review Commission, where there's sort of a specific amount of parking that was approved as a part of that approval, the application. So I think, yeah, it would require a modification to reduce the parking requirement in those cases. That would still be effective unless there was a mod.
So I had a question just more on process. So there's so much information that you went through in those 22 pages, and all the requirements and the options A and options B. How do you, as a group, at least in the past, a working session, what does that mean exactly? Is there a big whiteboard where we're putting pros and cons, or, how does it work? Because there's so much to go through, and it's so technical, and it's hard sometimes to really understand the ramifications the way I think, James, you're talking to. How do we, I guess, make this really informed decision that's collaborative against so much information? I'm just curious, what have you done in the past?
A lot of times we try to ensure that we use these work sessions to get direction from the Planning Commission on specific items. So it can be the case that, it depends on the project, of course, but for this particular project, it will likely look like, trying to at least get at least providing further information about the things you've already talked and expressed some questions about tonight, but to really just lay out those options in the staff report and essentially do kind of a more refined version of this where we really look for more direct direction, more specific direction from the Planning Commission on these options. So we don't necessarily have the storyboard fully outlined in terms of how we're going to present that to you. It's going to be a little bit contingent on the items that you identified tonight for further research, but we just try to unpack them with you and look for direction in some way from the commission as a whole that's somewhat consistent. So I think, there's a question as to, how do we unpack that information, but also how do, we get direction as staff from you as a commission with 7 different people that might have 7 different opinions here. But I'm happy to take any suggestions that you might have for specifically, if there are any questions related to the different options and maybe weighing the benefits of those options. I think we could go into lots of detail about whether or not parking, requirements are sustainable, or whether or not reducing parking requirements or eliminating them would actually reduce the climate-friendly outcomes. Ultimately, we do have a requirement from the state to take one of these paths. So it might be more beneficial to talk about the relative sort of impacts of these, if that's something that you think is beneficial for your decision-making.
Which goes back to James again, his earlier comments about what are we trying to achieve, and is there a better way to do it? James, is that right? Is that kind of what, did I summarize your thought there?
Well, I'm in a learning process, as you pointed out here, so I'm just trying to find my way through this. I'm used to looking at, okay, so where did this develop? And then how is that imposing anything on the city to do? Is there a mandate for the city to act in a particular way? And then if it is just that, then what is the best, are we being asked, what is the best way we could implement this?
Let me answer the first question. I've had an opportunity to do a little more research on the rule and rights. An enforcement order to require us to do it, okay, to require us to adopt code provisions and implement that. They could also hold up any shared revenue that comes to us, gas tax, and they can also stop us from issuing any land use permits. Okay. So we wouldn't have any development. So, it's not something where we're just going to thumb a nose at the LCD and say, make us. They can. So,
if I can jump in the question about process, because I think it's a great question, and somebody correct me if you think I'm saying this wrong. This sort of is the whiteboard session, like this first one. They've come with the memo, and it's here's the background, here's the context, and then our questions now here tonight are like the whiteboard. We think you should research more this way, or here's a couple questions, maybe we can go do that. And then they come back, and I don't remember the schedule off the top of my head, they come back with like a more refined staff memo that we then discuss, and we actually ask more informed questions, and we say, okay, now go down this path, or go down this path. So I think of like this session as the very first whiteboard of like, say what you want to say, ask any questions you want to ask. but like mine, which is, I don't want to give up on option one, as crazy as it is. So that's the way I've been looking at it. I'm not sure if the other commissioners have been looking at it the
I
same way.
think that's a good way to put it. I agree, Don.
Yeah, and I think what Planning Manager Olson wanted to do tonight was, because we have a lot of new commissioners and commissioners that weren't on when we first broached this subject over a year ago, it was really important to provide you an overview and a summary, because this is coming at you in the next year. And so this first session is really just an introductory. So you don't have to make any big decisions right now. It's just introducing you to the topic, trying to get an idea of what your big questions are so that we can kind of prepare for the next step. And there's going to be several study sessions, and in those study sessions, we're going to focus in on issues. We're going to provide more detailed analysis, so to help you, inform you, so that this commission can make decisions and recommendations, and then we'll kind of put us off to the next step. So it does feel overwhelming right now, but we will provide you more detailed information that will help you make a decision at
any point in the process, do you get any, I'll say you edit down, you're kind of getting down to the final direction. Do you get any sort of feedback from the community in general, whether you're just out talking to people? You know, how do you know that what we're suggesting finally is really what the people that we're representing want?
Well, we do have at least a schedule that would, again, there's public input that is allowed at all planning commission or city council meetings. So there is always an opportunity for folks to come in here and provide testimony, or I guess it's not considered testimony, but just public comment on any issues that we're discussing. We are looking at a public workshop event that would take place once we have a little bit more of a sense of the different options that we might want to explore, at least, and trying to get a little bit more feedback that's not at this whiteboard stage, if you will, once we have a little bit more direction from city council in particular. So there's opportunities there, and of course the public hearing at the planning commission and at the city council involve extensive public noticing and formal opportunities for neighborhood associations or other members of the public to provide comment as well. So there are a number of different ways that we do look for that input. And again, this is going to be something that we're looking at in coordination with our housing production strategies, for which we also have a large public process, a housing production strategy task force, and many other sort of events that we're planning in the next year. So we have many opportunities to consider that sort of coordination or sort of cross-pollination of some of the parking approaches we could take with some of the housing approaches that we could take as well through that process, I suppose. So yeah, lots of opportunities for the public to provide comment, but unfortunately, we are limited to the state's options. So we're going to have to be fairly specific about that and just kind of try to reiterate that, because yeah, I think we might experience a lot of a lot of folks we might hear from a lot of folks that are concerned about reducing parking regulations, and there's no approach where we can't do that, at least to a certain extent. So yeah, we could hear, we want to take a sort of minimal approach. I think it's a little more complicated, as I think you've seen. When it came to our middle housing implementation, there was actually a very specifically defined by the state minimum compliance approach that we could take, and they outlined it fairly specifically. I'm not sure that either option 2 or 3 is going to have less impact than the other, and I think that's really, obviously option 1 as well. I think you could look at these in very different ways, but I don't think you could easily say one of them is the minimum compliance approach and one of them is not. I think there's one option that's kind of the above and beyond approach, if you will, the repeal of all parking mandates, and the others, I think we really have to look at in some fine-grained nuance to reach a decision. So anyway, I will also be discussing a public engagement plan with you at our next meeting, where you can provide more input on additional strategies, or just tell me now if you think we should do anything in particular that's not outlined in the schedule.
Okay.
Councillor Atkin, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I think
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
All right, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. I think that Manager Olson articulated it well, that this law is very specific. It gives us options, and those are the options we have to pick from and understand which one is better for the city of Lake Oswego, and go with those. At the same time, I wanted to reassure you or assure you that this is not the first time that the Lake Oswego city staff have done something like this. So I ask that you have some trust into what the staff is going to bring as a proposal, and then you can add on to that or take away, including the public input and so on and so forth. I think I'm comfortable with their experience and expertise to come to you with a proposal of how we're going to go about this. The other thing is, we may disagree with this, we may agree with this, but at the end of the day, this is what's put on our plate to discuss and pick and choose which one is best for Lake Oswego. Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, I'm going to move on. We have one other thing to talk about, right?
We do.
So this is the Neighborhood Coalition of Lake Oswego, and do you want to introduce it, or?
I'm happy to. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
So I come looking for a volunteer once again from the commission. This time we need a representative from the Planning Commission to serve on the Neighborhood Coalition of Lake Oswego, or the NCLO as it's referred to. And essentially, this is the body or the means that the city has to provide liability and accident insurance to recognize neighborhood associations for their meetings and social gatherings like picnics or work parties, et cetera. So it is the case that if they're going to rent out a space in a church or a Lake Oswego School District facility, they would be required to provide certificates of insurance. So this is essentially the vehicle that we can do that through. The board has at least 5 different directors on it from different neighborhood associations, and 1 representative from the Commission for Citizen Involvement, which is you all. The Planning Commission is the same body as the Commission for Citizen Involvement. So the board typically just meets once a year in June typically, but we're a little bit late this year. And yeah, we'd like to just see if there are any volunteers for a planning commissioner to serve as the NCLO liaison. It's a fairly, I don't want to sort of oversell this, but it is a fairly minimal commitment, I would say. But any volunteers?
I have a question. So besides that one annual meeting, is there any other time commitment for that?
There is not. There are some emails that you might receive to schedule that meeting, but that's about it.
Oh.
This would be an easy one. The next one may not be so easy. Right.
So we are looking to have somebody soon. So, if, we do need somebody from the CCI technically. So, I'm happy to accept any volunteers via email, but we're hoping to meet fairly soon. So
That was going to be my question,
Yeah.
if you've set a meeting date yet.
we have not set it yet. We wanted to wait until we had somebody on board from the CCI. And I think it's probably most effective to put you all on the spot, honestly. I don't know if we should wait on this. But if you can't select anybody, we can always work it out.
All right, we'll think about it, maybe over the next 24 hours, and let Eric know, please.
All right, thank you. Yeah, it's, we typically meet in June, so we are a little behind schedule. So yeah, hopefully we can take care of that soon, but please reach out to me via email if you're interested.
So do you want to move into the schedule review?
Happy to do that as well. So coming up at our next meeting, which is scheduled for August 14th, I will be providing an update on some recent progress and sort of a new project from the city to explore the implementation of a vertical housing tax credit program or a vertical housing development zone. And this is specific to the North Anchor development. A specific proposal, at least at the time being, would apply to that development. So that is something I will be bringing to you at our next meeting, and it's 3 weeks away, I suppose, at this point. And coming up after that on on August 28th, we'll have a hearing for the housing needs analysis update. So the 2023 housing needs analysis update, we actually distributed materials for that earlier today, distributed a notice, and actually have provided a draft of, an updated draft of the 2023 housing needs analysis for review 35 days in advance of that hearing. So there should be significant time to review that in advance.
Thank you. So for the new commissioners, that's actually a good point. The reason why we've got the 3-week jump is that we, as a planning commission, meet the 2nd and the 4th Mondays of the month. So sometimes we have an extra week in between, as in this case. So that's why it's 3 weeks instead of 2 weeks before we meet next. All right. With that, we are adjourned.